So I take for granted the protocol/formal greetings that have been made. It's the same nerdy party we're having. Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to hear an original presentation from one of today's most important thinkers in public law and political theory. I was going to say Rechtslehrer or théorie de l'État translated into political theories. It's more simple. Adrian Vermeule, Ralph S. Tyler Jr., Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School. Each of the dozen or so books published by Professor Vermeule has been a major contribution. The word contribution is often overused, yet in his case it is apt. Every one of his books has unsettled the established landmarks of public law scholarship and political theory, challenged conventional schools of thought, provoked reflection, and sparked debate. The same holds true, of course, of many among the more than 100 scholarly articles he has written, not to mention his shorter pieces, open letters, and blog posts. The publication of Common Good Constitutionalism in 2022 sent shockwaves through the field. In it, our speaker this evening placed equal blame on what were long considered the legal left and right, namely libertarians' originalism and progressives living pre-constitutionalism. In that book, Adrian Vermeule draws on Charles De Koninck, emphasizing in particular the idea that although prior and preeminent, the good of the community is itself the good of individuals. De Koninck, who perhaps offered the most philosophical account of Canadian federalism as a bulwark against the great state, also defended the primacy of the common good against the personalists, including, of course, Jacques Maritain, who, while equally seeking to repudiate both totalitarianism and individualism, made the human person the foundation and measure of society's good. So this is an idea Charles De Koninck fiercely opposed. One may recall the influence of personalism on the political and legal thought of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, notably discussed at the centenary colloquium at l'Université de Montréal in 2019. Now, the book, Common Good Constitutionalism, is, to be sure, a frontal critique of liberalism, which has underpinned virtually all approaches to constitutional studies since the end of World War II, and whose dominance only intensified after the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. In the legal sphere, this critique is directed at the various forms of legal positivism and ethical cynicism in an effort to reconnect with the classical tradition of natural law inherited from the jus commune and jus gentium. Professor Vermeule does not call for a simple return to the classical tradition, but for the recovery of its core theoretical insights and jurisprudential principles. More precisely, this means returning to the virtue of prudence through a conception of the common good that justifies the exercise of public power, and not merely as a set of rules. It's about justification of the action of public authorities. It also entails a recovery of the pedagogical conception of law and legislation, grounded in a vision of politics as an ethical community. Law can encourage those subject to it to form desires, habits, and beliefs that better track and promote communal well-being, Professor Vermeule writes in his book. And as he himself puts it again, this point outrages liberals and libertarians. Equally controversial today is the classical claim that a range of regime types can be ordered to the common good or not. If they are, says Adrien Vermeule, then they are just. And if they are not, they are tyrannical, but their justice is not defined by or inherent in any particular set of institutional forms. Adrien Vermeule's neoclassical approach to constitutional law, grounded in the common good, which is not a mere aggregation of private goods, yields a theory of rights quite distinct from the liberal one. He is convinced that Ronald Dworkin advanced a misguided view of rights as trumps over collective interests. Yet, as a methodology, he adopts Dworkin's moral reading of law and the Constitution, sharing the view that the provisions of the jus civile, that's how Adrien Vermeule calls positive law, can only be interpreted in light of principles of political morality that themselves form part of law. On this methodological point, I had practiced this word a bit. He follows Jeremy Waldron, but he goes further, insisting on the substantial unity of the common law and the jus commun. He also offers a critique of the tradition in Anglophone legal theory of cheerleading for the exceptionalism of the common law tradition. In other words, Adrien Vermeule takes pains to bring to light the civil law roots of the common law tradition, something which I expected to please a lot of people. Yet, way more than a Dworkinian or a Waldronian book, Common Good Constitutionalism, with its attempt at reviving and adapting the classical tradition of natural law as a juristic constitutional method, is a Villéan book. Here I'm alluding to Michel Villet's beautiful book, La formation de la pensée juridique moderne. Some regard Vermeule's book on common good constitutionalism as a turning point in his work. I was struck, however, by how it builds on his earlier writings while still breaking new ground. It is not only recently that Vermeule has defended the discretion of a strong public administration and the deference owed to it by the courts. He has long favored a powerful executive. From the beginning of his career, he has contested the judge's monopoly on declaring the law. He has consistently criticized the Madisonian conception of the separation of powers, the belief in an invisible hand, and the faith in a free market of ideas, all of which he argues reflect the quasi-religious character of liberalism. In his 2013 book, titled The Constitution of Risk, he emphasized the threats to liberty that come not from an overbearing state, but from private domination fostered by an overly weak one. In 2020, Adrien Vermeule, with Cass Sunstein, published Law and Leviathan, Redeeming the Administrative State. There, he appeared less intent on opposing law to the administrative state than on showing how administrative governance could be reconciled with rule of law values. Though not a work on substantive public policy, the introduction to the book made clear that, unlike Sunstein, Vermeule was not enthusiastic about welfarist cost-benefit analysis, while agreeing that the promotion of the common good and human well-being, broadly understood, are the proper ends of government. His book, Common Good Constitutionalism, then came as no surprise, or at least not as a complete surprise. It seeks to draw on the methodological implications of the ethical and political tradition of the common good for constitutional law. This conception does not claim that the individual should be absorbed into the political community or subjected to it. The end of the community, writes Vermeule, is ultimately to promote the good of individuals, but common goods are real as such and are themselves the highest goods for individuals. He writes that in the wake of Charles De Koninck. Among these common goods, he includes health, safety, and a right relationship to the natural environment. In a globalized world that relates to the natural and biological environment in a deeply disordered way, he writes, a just state is a state that has ample authority to protect the vulnerable from the ravages of pandemics, natural disasters, and climate change, and from the underlying structure of corporate power that contribute to these events. Without further delay, I give the floor to our keynote speaker, Professor Adrien Vermeule.
Thank you. Thank you, too. Oops. Doing right? Ah. Yeah, here we go. Okay, thank you. Ok, bonsoir à toutes et à tous. J'espère que vous me pardonnerez si je tente de dire quelques mots en français. Un français, il faut bien l'avouer, tout à fait approximatif. Simplement pour commencer, c'est un geste de respect envers la ville, l'occasion et surtout envers l'homme que nous célébrons aujourd'hui. Bien sûr, un français maladroit peut parfois être plus gênant que pas de français du tout. Et malgré mes bonnes intentions, il se peut que mon effort vous offense davantage que mon silence. Avec cette pensée quelque peu inquiétante, je vais maintenant passer à l'anglais, même si, comme vous le verrez, mon sujet et même mes diapositifs sont en général bilingues. Merci. I'm pleased and grateful to be here with all of you to help celebrate Charles De Koninck and Laval University. For many of us in the United States, this figure is of major central importance. I think people here might be shocked to realize how many young people in Washington, D.C. right now are running around with well-thumbed copies of The Primacy of the Common Good against the Personalists. It's become absolutely central to, thank you. Sorry. It's become absolutely central to the thinking, a lot of recent thinking in the United States. So I was so grateful to Maxime and others for inviting me to this. But it is a bit of an honor and also a puzzle to be asked to celebrate Charles De Koninck and at a symposium on constitutionalism. The reason being, it was a puzzle to me how a mere civil jurist could contribute to an appreciation of this figure. I'm no philosopher or theologian, and De Koninck is quite properly, for his philosophical and theological purposes, not mainly concerned to flesh out the institutional and legal implications of his views. That's perhaps not his main project, with some very important exceptions, such as his extended and illuminating treatment of confederation, which I'll discuss today. Fortunately, however, one of his most famous ideas is, I think, highly susceptible to a juristic interpretation, highly susceptible to discussion by a mere civil lawyer, and it comes out of a very rich juristic background. So my title is Un état despotique qui a plusieurs despotes, a juristic interpretation of the society of tyrants. And we'll see that I'm trying to interpret here this very famous passage from The Primacy of the Common Good against the Personalists, one of the passages that obsesses us in the United States. And he says, a society made up of persons who love their private good above the common good, or who identify the common good with the private good, is a society not of free men, but of tyrants. And thus the whole people, he's quoting Aquinas, thus the whole people become, as it were, one tyrant, who would use force on one another and whose eventual chief would be the shrewdest and strongest of tyrants, his subjects being only frustrated tyrants. What I'm going to do today is try to bring out just part of the very rich juristic background of this idea in the history of legal and constitutional theory. I can't bring out the whole history, it goes too far back, but I'm going to focus on Montesquieu. As we saw in my title, that's a quotation from De l'Esprit des Lois. And Montesquieu, turns out, offers some very deep thinking about the society of tyrants that I think helps to illuminate De Koninck. So what kind of interpretation am I going to get out of this voyage through Montesquieu back to De Koninck? Well, it's going to have a couple of different elements. One element is the loss of institutional structure that occurs when the common good is in some way misconceived in one of the ways De Koninck understood. We have a flattening of institutions, a simplification of institutions, a homogenization of institutions that results in a loss of a kind of complexity, a well-ordered complexity that Montesquieu calls the society of societies. We can think of it as a kind of well-ordered corporatism. When the common good is lost, Montesquieu will argue, and I think this is also very close to the heart of De Koninck's thought. When the common good is lost, we get a loss of this complex structure, and we get a flattening, a homogenization that in the extreme limit can become totalitarian. Now, I should stress that this is an interpretive lens for understanding Charles De Koninck. It's not a biographical or claim about the influences on him, although it wouldn't shock me, given that he was a highly educated man, if he had drawn on this rich juristic tradition. But I'm fortified in offering this connection by something that Thomas De Koninck wrote for the foreword of his brother's collected works on politics. And Thomas De Koninck wrote, he located his brother's political theory by saying this. He said, "On y trouve toute une philosophie politique s'inscrivant dans la lignée d'Aristote, Montesquieu, et Alexis de Tocqueville." Okay, so once I offer this interpretation, I will return to De Koninck and his contrast between the Confédération and le Grand État. And I'll discuss the following themes drawn from the consideration of Montesquieu. The society of tyrants has a dynamic relationship with the tyranny of one, with despotism of one or a few. It doesn't really matter. In the passage I quoted to you from The Primacy of the Common Good Against the Personalists, we see that the society of tyrants eventually becomes a tyranny of one through the domination of a chief who's the shrewdest and strongest of tyrants. And we will see this adumbrated as well. But, and here's the key thing, the dynamics run in both directions. That is, according to Montesquieu, the tyranny of one itself tends to become a society of tyrants. So it tends to devolve into a society of tyrants. And therefore, we reach something I will call the limit cycle of despotism. What is the limit cycle of despotism? It's one regime, but it's a funny kind of dynamic regime in which the regime in some fluid, unstable way alternates between the tyranny of one and the tyranny of many in constantly shifting phases. It's as though, my analogy is, ice and water are both phases of H2O. In this limit cycle of despotism, we have the same thing. We have a single regime that restlessly transforms between the tyranny of one and of many. Okay, I start with Montesquieu. And it turns out that he is, throughout his career, completely obsessed, in my view, with versions of what I'll call distributed despotism. So these are many tyrants, a multiplicity of tyrants, a multiplicity of despots, a society of despots. He keeps returning to this theme in all his major works, and it's very fundamental for him. I will start actually with some of his critiques of the Dutch Republic, where my ancestors are from, and of the Venetian Republic. And he offers these critiques in the Pensée. And his main critique goes like this. He thinks that the Dutch Republic was unfree when it lacked a stadtholder. Now that's a counterintuitive thought, but here's what he says. He says, I said if there were no king in England, the English would be less free. This is proven by Holland, where the people have become more enslaved since there's no longer a stadtholder. And he says all the magistrates, he means the magistrates of each city, become petty tyrants. So this is one of the earliest appearances for him of this thought of distributed despotism. And it comes up again in another Pensée. Unfortunately, I don't have the French here because I wanted to check the standard edition by de Grave, and I lost it, but I'll check it for the published paper. Anyway, he says in this one, Holland is no longer free since it no longer has a stadtholder. In Holland, the magistrates are free, but it's a bad thing when a magistrate is free as a magistrate. That's an interesting thought, that a magistrate might be free as a magistrate and that would be bad. And he says this happens if there's not some ordering and moderating power. He means that there should be some kind of complex structure that captures both the unity of the state and the plurality of the state. A complex corporate structure that holds the intermediate independent powers within appropriate boundaries. We see this again when he discusses the Venetian Republic in the Pensée. He says that the Venetian Republic ends up being an assembly of tyrants. So another appearance of this theme that interests him. Why is this? Well, he says that the Doge of the Republic is a civil magistrate, and as we know from history, a weak civil magistrate. Chance and necessity gave Holland a stadtholder, and she did great things, but the Republic of Venice, with its civil leader from the hereditary nobility, cannot but fall into languor. The Grand Council is an assembly of civil tyrants. They cannot be great men, and they prevent others from becoming so. So I think this is what people today call crab bucket politics in the Republic of Venice. Okay, let me pass now to, of course, the great juristic work, de l'esprit des lois, and I will try to bring out for you how deeply this theme of many tyrants is, in my view, central to this work. I claim that Montesquieu in this great work sees the loss of structure as a crucial symptom of systemic breakdown for all the three major forms of well-ordered political regimes that he identifies. So these are democratic republics, aristocratic republics, and well-ordered monarchy, meaning the rule of one man according to fundamental laws through intermediate independent powers. And indeed, I'm going to go farther and claim that the society of tyrants, of many despots, appears also as the final breakdown even of despotism itself. And we will see that, hopefully, to your satisfaction as I go on. What are the causes of this loss of structure? I'll claim that in De l'Esprit des Lois, the causes are those so pithily identified by Charles De Koninck in the passage I quoted at the beginning. Either because the society is made up of persons who love their private good above the common good, or of persons who identify the common good with the private good, both of those things being mistakes. What are the consequences of loss of structure? We lose our complex legal corporatist structure, what Montesquieu calls a society of societies, which is characteristic of a well-ordered regime, and it dissolves into a simplistic but horrifying état despotique qui a plusieurs despotes. Okay, let me begin with democratic republics. For Montesquieu, the corruption that can occur in a democratic republic occurs when they lose their internal structure and ordering. When does that happen? That's when the demos comes to prefer the individuated private good over the structured common good. This is the first of De Koninck's pathways to the society of tyrants. This occurs when the passion for equality overwhelms the institutional structure and dissolves the institutional structure. He says, when the extreme passion for equality is taken up, each one wants to be the equal of those chosen to command. The people, finding intolerable even the power they entrust to others, want to do everything themselves. They want to deliberate for the Senate, to execute for the magistrates, and to cast aside all the judges. This radical equality then leads to a kind of first distributed despotism, a society of tyrants, and then it leads to the tyranny of one. This is the stages. He says, the more the people appear to take advantage of their liberty, the nearer they approach the moment they are to lose it. Stage one, petty tyrants are formed. Here we have again this theme that appeared in the Pensée. Petty tyrants are formed, having all the vices of a single one. What remains of liberty soon becomes intolerable, and we choose a single tyrant, or a single tyrant chooses him or herself, and the people lose everything, even the advantages of their corruption. And sometimes this is chosen as a desperate, helpless remedy precisely against the society of tyrants, which we find intolerable, as Montesquieu says. But this is, of course, a bad cycle. A different version of this bad cycle happens in aristocratic republics. Here we have a different pathway to the loss of structure. It's when a limited class comes to equate the general common good with the limited private good of their particular class. So we have a kind of class interest. And he says aristocracy is corrupted when the power of the nobles becomes arbitrary. The ruling families cease to observe the laws. They throw off the shackles of the law. And then we have a despotic state that has many despots. In this case, the republic continues to exist only with regard to the nobles and only among them. The body that governs is a republic, and the body that is governed is a despotic state. And these are the two most ill-matched bodies in the world. So what we have is a partial failure of structure that produces a kind of monstrous polity like a centaur, partly republic, partly despotism. Okay, so far I have not fully substantiated my thesis that the society of tyrants is the way that all Montesquieu's regimes fail, and the alert reader of Montesquieu may notice that when he discusses the corruption of monarchy, he doesn't mention distributed despotism or the society of tyrants. He says, just as democracies are ruined when the people strip the Senate, the magistrates and judges of their functions, so too monarchies are corrupted when the prerogatives of the established bodies are removed. We'll get this loss of corporate complexity, and the privileges of the towns are removed. And in the democratic case, one approaches the despotism of all. That's the society of many despots. And the other, the despotism of one alone. But, although I have not yet substantiated my thesis, I persist, and I claim that this is just the first stage in a further process. And what happens in the further process And Montesquieu, I think, is quite clear that this happens in any of the regime types he identifies. What happens in the further process is that the despotism of one itself loses even the structure that it has and becomes a despotism of many. How does this happen? It happens in two stages. And this is what Montesquieu sees as the kind of structural propensity of despotism. Maybe it's not necessary in some kind of logical sense, but it's a standing tendency of despotism to go through these stages. The first stage is that the despot appoints a vizier. So the despot appoints a person to run the government for him or her. This is because the despot is by definition a captive of his or her own whims and passions. This is what it means to be a despot. And the despot abandons public business because it's too burdensome to indulge his passions or whims, and appoints a vizier who will instantly have the same power as he. So in despotism, the establishment of a vizier is a fundamental law. Think, I don't know, Dick Cheney or something. Sorry. Can we cut that from the video? Okay. Stage two, however, the society of tyrants reappears in a new form because the nature of delegation in a despotism is such that the vizier must entrust despotic power within limited domains to all of the subordinate officials in the polity. Montesquieu contrasts delegation under monarchy, which is well-ordered delegation, with the kind of delegation that happens under despotism. And he says, in despotism, power passes entirely into the hands of him to whom it is entrusted. The vizier is the despot himself, and each individual officer is the vizier. And he goes on to explain that each of the individual officers down this sort of chain of despotism act not according to fundamental law, but only according to their own will and caprice. They are like mini despots. They are created in the image of the despot in a kind of horrid parody of the imago Dei. So God creates man in his image. The despot creates little despots in his image through delegation to the vizier. And so, just as the tyranny of many, the society of tyrants, becomes a tyranny of one, we've already seen that in both Montesquieu and De Koninck, and that's a very old thought in political theory. So too, the tyranny of one, or despotism, becomes a tyranny of many. And we get this kind of limit cycle of despotism. And in this limit cycle of despotism, we see that the despotism of many and of one are at bottom the same regime in different phases, as water and ice are different phases of H2O. What's horrifying about this regime is that it lacks the resources from within itself ever to heal, to ever generate or regenerate a genuinely complex and subsidiary order, a society of societies. It cannot, by its own effort, become a society of orders moderately governed. And I want to, if I can now find it in my text, I want to read to you this parable that Montesquieu gives about the Greek colony of Syracuse in Sicily. And here's what Montesquieu says. This is an image of the limit cycle of despotism. He says of Syracuse, "This town, always licentious or oppressed, equally tormented by its liberty and by its servitude, always receiving one or the other like a tempest, had an immense population whose only choice was the cruel one between giving itself to a tyrant or being one, being a tyrant. So we have this alternation between the society of tyrants that everybody finds intolerable and the tyranny of one, a hopeless remedy against the society of tyrants in which all are oppressed in a different way. And Syracuse and Montesquieu's view keeps alternating helplessly between these two. What I want to bring out, and then I'll turn immediately to De Koninck, is I want to bring out is the striking homogeneity of the units that make up the society of tyrants and the tyranny of one that make up the despotic cycle. There's a fundamental paradox here. The society that has a more complicated and reticulated internal structure, a true society of societies, paradoxically in a certain way displays less homogeneity among the units of that society, but also displays more love of the common good of all by all. By contrast, in the society of tyrants, the units are homogeneous in a certain sense. They're all composed primarily of the passion to dominate and of a certain instrumental rationality that they try to get one over on each other. But the societies become homogenized in a profound way. Each of these units has the identical hopes and fears. Each hopes for domination, fears domination by the others, and if one of them happens to turn out to be stronger, that's a kind of accident. In The Primacy of the New Order, another essay of De Koninck that is mandatory reading in Washington, D.C., he puts it this way. He says that this homogeneity is the hallmark of a polity that's lost the common good. He says, the common good doesn't require a homogeneity of subjects, quite the opposite. The paradox is that a genuine diversity of subjects conduces more to the common good than this kind of flattened homogeneity. Indeed, as I'll now explain, this kind of homogeneity is the main feature of the lamentable regime that De Koninck calls le grand état. So as others have already mentioned, I refer to this wonderful testimony submitted to a Royal Commission of Inquiry on Constitutional Problems, I think in 1953, if I have the date right, 54?
Established in 1950.
And I see, yes, gotcha. And it's titled La Confédération rempart contre le grand État. And he says, I think this striking document, which applies the theory of the common good in detail to a bunch of problems, resonates strongly with these themes of loss of structure, excessive simplification, and loss of the complexity of a society of societies. So for De Koninck, le grand état is a state in which simplification distorts or even eliminates true politics. True politics is the political life of the city, which is possible only at lower levels of subsidiarity. Of course, within a genuinely confederated republic, which is different than the grand état, this simplification occurs fundamentally through quantification and homogenization that results from quantification. It distorts the politics of the common good by turning it into an aggregative and utilitarian pseudo-politics or anti-politics. So in order to make the citizenry legible and quantifiable, le grand état simplifies and homogenizes both the people and the internal structure of the state. This looks backwards to Aristotle, of course, with De Koninck. It also looks back, in my view, to Montesquieu, who praises confederated republics while warning again and again of the simplifying and homogenizing tendencies of despotism. It anticipates work like James Scott's Seeing Like a State, and I think these are all in a certain line of thinking. What are the consequences of this simplifying and homogenizing character, anti-political character of le grand état We get the loss of the complex and compound structure of the society of societies. This phrase actually comes from when Montesquieu discusses confederated republics, and I think that discussion is right in the background of what De Koninck is saying, or it's the best way for me to interpret it. That's the main consequence for the polity, but there's also a consequence for individuals. In the Grand État, we get a kind of distributed despotism of many who collectively and in the aggregate, but not as a community, in the aggregate, they share political power. But each of them is kind of reduced to a life of material appetites and fantasies of domination. And this is now anachronistic because it's really after De Koninck, but you think of the online seraglio of the internet as the place where these mini despots work out their slavery to their own appetites and their fantasies of domination. Well, that's all I had to say. I guess I want to express my belief that Thomas de Koninck was profoundly correct, maybe even more correct than he knew, in identifying Charles de Koninck as an intellectual inheritor of Montesquieu, despite the apparent differences in method and purpose between these two figures, the great jurist and the great philosopher. And I think it's I hope you agree, it's an example of how philosophers and jurists can mutually benefit each other in understanding, I think, the very rich juristic background of de Koninck's ideas. Okay, thank you.